Hello everybody and welcome to Law Bite number 355, dated September 12th, 2022. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This Law Bite is entitled The Unwritten Constitution of the United Kingdom. Before I begin, however, I'd like to formally invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, Juarez Lee Shelton, MA. And in addition to that, please also click on the little notification bell immediately to the right of the subscribe button. In doing so, you will receive notifications when I post new, exciting, and enlightening videos in history, law, political science, theology, and philosophy. Thank you so much in advance. You are the best. And in addition to that, I would like to give an incredibly warm and more than deserving honorable mention to my UK-born brother from another mother and fellow historian, Kwame. Like my own page, he directs an educational channel entitled Skeleton Keys Productions, where viewers are enlightened on various subjects in history, law, and political science. Please check it out and subscribe to his channel. He is a scholar well beyond his years, and you will not be disappointed. That's for you, Kwame. All the best, my brother. So, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, otherwise known as Great Britain or the UK, is one of 3 countries in the world that has an unwritten national constitution. The others following this example are New Zealand and Israel. The term unwritten constitution is actually a misnomer, as multiple aspects of the constitutions of these countries are indeed written in black letter. The more appropriate expression, though less utilized, is Uncodified Constitution. That simply means that these nations do not have their entire constitutions contained within a single document, such as with the United States or France, for example. They still, however, have existing law derived from many sources, which is certainly written, that constitutes an official uncodified constitution. With respect to the United Kingdom, the sources of their uncodified constitution are as follows: fundamental principles, acts and statutes of parliament, conventions of government, international treaties, and legal precedents and case law. In addition to explaining these things, we shall also present the advantages and disadvantages of having an unwritten or uncodified constitution. We begin with the sources of the UK's unwritten constitution. Source number 1, fundamental principles. Beginning with fundamental principles, we start with parliamentary sovereignty. Parliamentary sovereignty is a principle that holds that Parliament is the supreme and highest lawmaking authority in the United Kingdom. There is no force or authority in the UK which can overrule or second-guess Parliament, not even the monarch or the Supreme Court. In essence, what Parliament says goes, and it has the final word on all things legal in the UK. Parliament, however, may restrict its own powers, such as with the Human Rights Act of 1998, or similarly, devolve its powers, such as with the Scotland Act of 1998, which established a parliament for Scotland with limited administrative authority. Parliamentary sovereignty is generally regarded as the defining principle of the UK Constitution. The next fundamental principle is the rule of law. The rule of law is an ancient principle of governance whereby no person is able to exercise arbitrary, unquestionable authority unto themselves. Instead, all authority is regulated by established and well-defined laws. The next principle is separation of powers. Separation of powers is a legal concept whereby the branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, are separate and have distinct areas of authority. These areas of authority are usually clear and do not overlap with one another. With this, no branch may intervene on the powers of the other 2 branches and exercise the powers of the other 2 branches. The next principle is an independent judiciary. An independent judiciary consists of a judicial branch which is strong, impartial, and free from political control with respect to its decision-making process. Last, but not least, is royal prerogative. This concept is one whereby the power of the crown, aka the monarch, is exercised by the prime minister, who is the head of government in the United Kingdom. That takes us to the next source of law, Acts of Parliament. The next source of constitutional law from the UK comes from Acts of Parliament. These are legislative enactments from Parliament which are formally known as constitutional statutes. Such statutes are exceptionally authoritative and viewed as the Constitution, as opposed to other less significant Acts of Parliament. Some examples of these include, but are not limited to, the Bill of Rights of 1689, the Acts of Union, 1707 and 1800, the Act of Settlement, 1701, Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949, the Human Rights Act of 1998, the Scotland Act, the Northern Ireland Act, and the Government of Wales Act, all of 1998. When speaking of these acts and others with the same weight, MPs, members of Parliament, including the Prime Minister, routinely refer to aspects of them as the Constitution. In essence, Parliament's power to enact laws is all that is needed to amend the Constitution, as ordinary legislation is all that is needed to update existing law in whatever format, making new constitutional law. No previous Parliament can bind a future Parliament. The laws can always be changed and updated as needed. That takes us next to conventions of government. The next feature of the UK's Unwritten Constitution consists of conventions of government. These are long-established traditions of government that have evolved over time, which have been accepted and subsequently codified into law in such texts as the Cabinet Manual. Examples include the Prime Minister always coming from the lower house of Parliament, the House of Commons. Next, the monarch always acting upon ministerial advice. And last but not least, the monarch always appointing as Prime Minister the MP, or Member of Parliament, who most commands the confidence of the House of Commons. That takes us next to international treaties. The next type of binding constitutional law for the UK is that of international treaties. These are international agreements between the UK and various members of the international community which have binding effects on the UK's fundamental law. Some of these include the North Atlantic Treaty of 1949, otherwise known as NATO, the Treaty of London, 1949, the United Nations Charter, 1945, the European Convention on Human Rights, 1950, and prior to their withdrawal in 2020, multiple treaties related to the European Union. Such agreements have had or have the force of binding law, binding constitutional authority on UK law at the highest level, rendering them essentially part of the Constitution. That takes us next to legal precedents and case law. The final mode of the UK's unwritten constitution comes from legal precedents and case law. Here, important decisions from officials in government, the courts, and most significantly the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, have the authority to set legal precedent in the UK. Constitutional law, significant constitutional questions decided by the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom have the force of law, and depending on the issues in the case, may restrain the actions of various government officers or other subordinate entities. Case law in the UK, much like in the United States and other common law countries, quite often has the same authoritative force as acts of Parliament, or in America's case, Congress. Okay? That takes us to Section 2, Guardians of the Constitution. There are several entities which serve as guardians of the UK's unwritten constitution. Such entities ensure when disputes over interpretation and implementation arise that the Constitution is followed as it should be. They are as follows: the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, the House of Lords Constitution Committee, the Commons Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, the Lord Chancellor, and specific constitutional watchdogs such as the Judicial Appointments Commission and the Electoral Commission. With respect to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, unlike the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court of the UK does not possess the power or authority to overrule or strike down an act of Parliament. While it is possible that the court may find an act of Parliament to be contrary to other existing law, its authority or existing precedent or established precedent, so to speak, its authority does not permit it to strike down an act of Parliament per se. Instead, the court would likely hold the action invalid and suggest what may or may not need to occur, leaving the final decision making on the law to Parliament itself. Keep one thing in mind, my fellow Americans. In Britain, Parliament, like I mentioned earlier, is supreme, and parliamentary sovereignty, is the most important principle of the UK Constitution. Unless it is otherwise binded by its own enactments, Parliament decrees the law in the UK. What Parliament says goes, and no authority in the UK may undermine Parliament's authority. Parliamentary sovereignty is the most important principle of the UK Constitution. All right? I'm sure a lot of people have suggested in the US that that's the way the framers intended Congress to be. However, any notions of that were thrown out very early in American history with the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, where the Supreme Court essentially established itself as the final authority on the meaning of the law in the United States, unless otherwise, depending on the type of case at hand, overturned by a constitutional amendment, or an act of Congress itself, again, depending on the issue. But when the Supreme Court invokes the Constitution, it has firmly established itself in America as the final authority on the meaning of the Constitution, again, unless overruled by a constitutional amendment. So that takes us to Section 3 on the pros and the cons of an unwritten or uncodified Constitution. We begin with the pros of an unwritten Constitution. On its face, an uncodified Constitution may seem like a recipe for disaster, but believe it or not, there is a plus side to this design. The main advantage is that the uncodified constitutions are usually much easier to change, as they typically have no formal amendment process. A simple law superseding the existing law is usually all it takes to update the document per se, and therefore such constitutions can more readily and easily be updated to meet the ever-changing needs of society than written ones, which often contain a somewhat difficult amendment process, such as with Article 5 of the Constitution here in the United States. With the U.S. Constitution, you would need at least 38 states to approve a proposed amendment, 3/4 of them, 75%, which is not an easy threshold to accomplish. That takes us next to the disadvantages of an unwritten Constitution. Now we get to the meat. As you would expect, there are more disadvantages than advantages to an unwritten or uncodified Constitution. First, because there is no single written codified document, there is no such document which clearly has a higher legal status over other laws and statutes. Unlike with the U.S., where the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land, that's it. No cut cards, straight to the point. The Constitution this, the Constitution that. Versus with the uncodified Constitution, the Constitution is coming from so many different sources. There is no one single document that people can point to. Bam! This is the law. This is the supreme law of the land. So the second disadvantage is, as the Constitution comes from a variety of different sources, like I just said, it's less accessible, less transparent, and less understandable. Third, with no clear separation of powers between the branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, as defined in a written codified Constitution, there is inevitable ambiguity on the reach of each branch's powers, which can lead to inter-branch conflict. Fourth, the flexible nature of unwritten constitutions may lead to conflicting interpretations of the various sources from which it's derived, and by each branch of government. I'll add that too. Okay, such conflict leads to instability, possibly, and the potential for government deadlock and inefficiency. Not to say that's going to happen, but it certainly opens the door for it to occur. The real losers in this, cat and mouse game, so to speak, would of course be the general public, okay, for whom the government is meant to serve. So, in conclusion, while the UK lacks a formal written or codified constitution, as we're used to here in the United States of America, for example, they do not lack an efficient system of constitutional law, as we've seen. Their system, though not as clear-cut, provides for constitutional law to be found through various sources, all of which are unique and, unlike with a codified document, can more readily be updated to meet current needs. Additionally, a codified document such as we've always had in America is not a complete solution to all problems. Heck, we've got a codified constitution, and the reach of each branch of government still, is in dispute at times. The reach of the president with respect to war powers is quite often been a touchy subject. The reach of congressional power over the states, the reach of the courts, all of these things, despite of having a written codified constitution, all of these things are definitely still very much sources of conflict at times, all right, between the branches of government, Thus, the grass is not always greener on the other side, all right? A written codified constitution is not a tell-all solution to these problems. However, it does provide perhaps more clarity over the reach and the scope of power of each branch of the government, all right? Theoretically providing clear, distinct boundaries upon which the other two branches cannot enter, and a system of checks and balances so that each branch somehow in some way has the power to check the power of the abilities of the other two branches. All right. That may be less, defined in an uncodified constitution versus in a codified one. The ability of branches to check the power of one another and clear abilities to check the power of one another, such as the president being able to veto acts of Congress, the courts being able to strike down executive and legislative actions as being unconstitutional, and legislative ability to reject presidential appointments, and refuse to fund branches of government and confirm judges to office. Each branch has the ability to check the other two somehow, some way. And so with a written codified constitution, those powers are more clearly defined and established versus the uncodified one, where a lot of it, not to sound disparagingly, may be more up in the air and more established by tradition rather than black letter law. So while the uncodified method may not be what we're used to here in America, it has worked seemingly well for the UK for centuries, long before America was even thought of, all right? And as the British people, a wonderful people indeed, are very inclined to adhere to tradition, this is not likely to change anytime in the near future, all right? So I thank you so much for watching this video on the unwritten, uncodified UK Constitution. If you have any questions or controversies, you can leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. If you like this video, you learned a thing or two, gained some insight on it, drop me a like. Likes go a long way in the world of YouTube. And as I conclude, I leave you with the timeless words of Mr. George Feeney, one of my teaching role models. Believe in yourself, dream, try, and do good. All right? And as you all know, I'm a diehard Anglophile. So as I conclude, God save the King and all the best to King Charles. Take care, and I'll see you at the next video. Peace.